For most of modern history, we're taught to imagine the early 1800s as a dim world. A world lit by flickering flame, oil lamps, whale oil, basic gas lanterns that barely pushed light a few meters beyond the curb. That's the picture we're given. Cities wrapped in shadow, nighttime movement limited, public lighting described as unreliable, uneven, and primitive. And on paper, that story sounds reasonable, until you actually look at the evidence that survived. Because scattered across old photographs, engravings, city surveys, and early visual records, there is a different picture. One that doesn't fit the official description at all. Cities that appear well lit far earlier than they should be. Streets illuminated evenly, not sporadically. Lampposts built not like simple holders of flame, but like industrial structures. Massive bases, thick metal columns, complex assemblies of copper, iron, and glass. These weren't small lanterns attached to poles. They were machines. And that's where the questions begin. According to conventional history, gaslighting in the early 1800s was basic and inefficient. Gas pressure was low, infrastructure was limited, manufacturing precision was inconsistent. Yet the earliest lampposts photographed in cities like Paris, London, Vienna, Prague, St. Petersburg, and New York look anything but basic. Their bases are overbuilt, sometimes wider than modern utility poles. Their metalwork is intricate, symmetrical, and standardized. Their height and spacing follow precise patterns. This is not how early experimental technology usually looks. Early systems are messy, uneven, local, but these lamps appear deliberate. Uniform designs repeating across countries separated by oceans, the same proportions, the same crowns, the same structural logic. And that raises a simple question. Why would a technology still in its infancy be rolled out with this level of confidence? Because confidence implies reliability, and reliability implies something had already been tested. Then there's the timeline problem. Many of these lamps appear before cities officially had the industrial capacity to mass-produce complex cast-iron components at scale. Some appear in districts that supposedly lacked gas supply at the time. Others are placed in locations that make little sense for basic illumination. Wide plazas, monumental bridges, civic centers, areas that required consistent, stable light, not flickering flame. Even more puzzling are the early nighttime photographs. We're told they rely on long exposure. And yes, long exposure explains some brightness. But it does not explain uniform illumination across entire streets. Long exposure amplifies existing light. It doesn't create it. So what exactly was already there? The lamps themselves offer clues. Look closely at their structure. Multiple vents, layered metal housings, glass chambers larger than needed for a flame, crowns and caps shaped less like weather protection and more like engineered components. These designs appear far more complex than necessary for burning gas. And here's where the mystery deepens. As soon as photography becomes widespread, as soon as cities begin to be visually documented in detail, these lamps begin to disappear. They are replaced, simplified, downsized. In many cities, the earliest, most elaborate lamp designs vanish within a few decades. There's no long debate in records, no gradual evolution. They're simply gone. And that pattern repeats across continents. Which brings us to something important. This episode is not claiming that electricity existed earlier than recorded. It's not claiming science fiction. It's pointing to a visual and architectural mismatch, a moment in history where the hardware does not match the story, where infrastructure appears more advanced, more coordinated, and more standardized than the narrative allows. Before we go any further, it's important to say this clearly. Everything discussed here is based on real photographs, surviving structures, and documented urban layouts. No assumptions are required, only observation. If you value this kind of careful, evidence-based exploration into history's unanswered questions, make sure you're subscribed. It helps this channel continue documenting details that are often ignored. Now here's the key realization that sets the rest of this series in motion. These lamps don't behave like isolated inventions. They behave like components, parts of something larger. And when you stop looking at them individually and start looking at where they were placed, how they were spaced, and what stood around them, a second pattern emerges. Because these lamps weren't standing alone, they were positioned near towers, near spires, near massive rooftops, near civic buildings built with the same architectural language, which suggests the lighting wasn't just about illumination, it was about integration. And that leads us directly into the next part of this investigation. In the next episode, we'll look at the structures that surrounded these lamps, the towers, platforms, rooftops, and architectural features that appear again and again in the same cities. Because once you see the infrastructure on the ground, the idea that these were just gas lamps becomes much harder to defend. When you stop focusing on the lamps themselves and start looking at what surrounds them, a second pattern quietly emerges. Because these lamps were never isolated objects, they were almost always positioned near specific architectural features, structures that repeat across cities, cultures, and continents. Tall towers, wide platforms, elevated rooftops, spire-topped buildings, flat, reinforced surfaces where nothing practical seems to belong. And once you notice this, it becomes impossible to unsee. In city after city, the most elaborate lamps appear near civic centres. Not factories, not warehouses, not slums. Government buildings, opera houses, train stations, grand hotels, administrative halls, places designed for coordination, not decoration. Early photographs from Paris show massive lamp installations aligned with wide boulevards and tall stone towers. Towers officially described as ornamental, yet built with internal stairways, access hatches, and reinforced crowns. London shows the same thing. Lamp clusters near elevated rooftops and spires that do not match church design, nor industrial function. Structures far too solid for aesthetics alone. In St. Petersburg, the pattern becomes even clearer. Here, lamps appear repeatedly near tall columned buildings, with rooftop platforms large enough to support equipment, yet no official records explain what that equipment was. These rooftops weren't pitched, they weren't decorative, they were flat, accessible, engineered. And then there is Chicago, a city officially described as young, yet early photographs show reinforced rooftops and elevated platforms appearing before modern cranes, before skyscrapers, before heavy industrial machinery. Why would a young city build upward platforms before it even built upward buildings? The official explanations always fall back on vague language. Design trends, architectural fashion, urban beautification. But beautification does not require load-bearing reinforcement. It does not require access ladders. It does not require internal cavities and anchor points. And yet, these features appear again and again. What's more telling is where these structures are not found. They are rarely near coal plants, rarely near smokestacks, rarely near gas production facilities, which raises a quiet but unavoidable question. If these lamps were powered by gas, why isn't the surrounding architecture designed around gas infrastructure? Instead, what we see looks like support architecture, points of access, points of elevation, points of alignment, almost as if the lamps were part of something larger, not just a lighting system, but a spatial system. And here's where Tartaria enters, carefully, without mythology, not as an empire, not as a fantasy, but as a pattern of design, a shared architectural language that appears before modern industrial planning, before standardized engineering codes, before global manufacturing. Tall structures placed for elevation rather than defense. Platforms placed where visibility and access matter. Rooftops engineered as if they were meant to host something, and later stripped of it. In this framework, the 19th century didn't invent these layouts. It inherited them, reused them, renamed them, and slowly forgot their original purpose. Once the air above cities became empty, the architecture beneath lost its explanation. Towers became ornamental, platforms became unused, rooftops became decorative. The function disappeared, but the structure remained. And this brings us to the question viewers are already forming. If the lamps weren't just lamps, and the surrounding architecture wasn't random, then how did the system actually work? Because there's one detail that hasn't been addressed yet, and it's the most unsettling of all. These lamps and aerial objects appear to operate without smoke, without noise, and without visible fuel. And that takes us directly to the technology itself. In the next episode, we'll examine the one thing history never clearly explains: how these systems functioned without fire, without engines, and without fuel trails. Because once we look at how they moved, the gas lamp explanation finally collapses. Up to this point, everything we've looked at could still be dismissed as coincidence. Overbuilt lampposts, strangely precise grids, architectural features that feel out of place, skeptical explanations still exist. But there is one aspect of these systems that cannot be brushed aside. Because regardless of how ornate a structure is, regardless of how standardized a network appears, at some point, it must function. And this is where the official explanation begins to fail. According to the historical narrative, 19th century street lighting relied on fire, gas combustion, open flames, heat, smoke, soot, constant maintenance. But when you examine the visual record closely, something is missing. There is no smoke, no blackened stone, no soot stains rising up lampposts, no burn marks on nearby facades, no residue on balconies or windows directly above lamps that supposedly burned every night for decades. In dense cities like Paris, London, Vienna, and Prague, that absence is impossible to ignore. If thousands of open flames burned night after night beneath stone buildings, the evidence would be everywhere. And yet, it isn't. Even more unusual is how clean the lamps appear in early photographs. Not recently cleaned, not selectively framed, uniformly clean, across entire boulevards. This leads to the next inconsistency: maintenance. Gas lamps require constant attention. Valves, fuel pressure, leaks, ignition, extinguishing, cleaning. Yet historical photographs show entire cities illuminated, with only a handful of lamplighters documented. No carts of fuel, no visible gas infrastructure at street level, no storage facilities nearby. And many of these lamps appear lit in daylight photographs, not glowing weakly, but visibly bright. That should not be possible with flame-based systems. Long exposure can amplify light, but it cannot create uniform illumination where none exists, which raises a quiet but critical question. If these weren't burning fuel the way we're told, what were they actually doing? This is where the physical design becomes important. Gas lamps do not require multi-layered metal crowns, hollow vertical shafts, symmetrical plate assemblies, copper-heavy alloys, internal cavities running deep underground. Yet these features appear again and again, across continents, across decades, across cultures, and they appear before electrical theory is supposed to exist at scale. Some of these lamps resemble modern electrical components more than combustion devices. They look less like lanterns and more like terminals. Collectors and restoration workers have noted something else. When old lamps were dismantled, many contained no evidence of long-term burning, no charred interiors, no heavy residue, no heat damage consistent with decades of flame. In some cases, the internal chambers were too narrow to safely house combustion at all, which suggests the light source may not have been fire. And then there's the silence. Eyewitness accounts describe streets illuminated without noise, no hissing, no roaring, no crackling. Gas systems are loud, especially at scale. But these cities were quiet. And when you step back and connect this with everything else, the grids, the placement, the crowns, the rooftops, the alignment, another possibility emerges. Not a conclusion, a possibility. What if these lamps were not producing light, but conducting it? What if illumination was a byproduct of a larger system, one that moved energy rather than burned fuel? Atmospheric electricity, ground current, passive induction, resonance. These ideas were not unknown in the 1800s. They were actively explored, publicly discussed, then gradually abandoned. And notably, many of the architectural forms associated with these lamps, domes, spires, finials, towers, are shapes known to interact with fields, vibration, and charge. This doesn't require lost magic. It doesn't require fantasy. Only the possibility that an older system existed, was partially reused, and later misunderstood. Which would explain something else. Why the transition away from these lamps was so abrupt. There was no long phase of coexistence, no public debate, no gradual improvement. The ornate lamps disappear. Simpler posts replace them. Coal, smoke, and centralized power take over, and the cleaner, quieter system is quietly erased. If gas lighting was so inefficient, so primitive, so inferior, why does the replacement look like a downgrade? Why does illumination become harsher, smokier, louder? Unless the goal wasn't improvement, unless the goal was control, because systems that don't require fuel pipelines don't require centralized supply, and systems like that are difficult to regulate. Which brings us to the final tension of this episode. If these lamps were part of a larger, inherited system, one not fully understood by the people who inherited it, then their removal wasn't just technological. And in the next episode, we look at the moment this entire system collapses. Not gradually, not over centuries, but within a surprisingly narrow window of time. Because for decades, these lamps dominate city streets across Europe, North America, and parts of Asia. They are everywhere, uniform, integrated into the architecture, treated as permanent infrastructure, and then, almost without warning, they begin to disappear. Between the late 1800s and the early 1900s, something changes. The ornate lamps vanish, the heavy bases are removed, the crowns disappear, the grids dissolve, and the replacements look nothing like what came before. Slim poles, simpler fixtures, bare functionality, no elaborate metalwork, no monumental bases, no harmonized design with surrounding buildings. The shift is abrupt enough that it raises an immediate question. Why wasn't there a transition phase? If these lamps were simply outdated gas technology, we would expect debate, trials, hybrid systems, decades of overlap. But that's not what the record shows. Instead, cities act decisively. Old lamps are dismantled, foundations are destroyed, Pavements are dug up and replaced. Entire streets are relaid, and in many cases, the removal happens before the new systems are even ready, which makes no sense if the goal was simple modernization. Because replacing a working system with nothing temporarily creates darkness, disruption, and cost. Unless the goal wasn't replacement, unless the goal was removal, look closely at what happens next. As the old lamp networks vanish, a new energy model rises at the exact same time. Coal, steam, centralized power plants, smoke, fuel dependency. Energy moves away from passive, distributed systems and into centralized, metered, controllable ones. Light no longer comes from the street itself. It comes from distant facilities, from wires owned, regulated, and billed. And with that shift, the old infrastructure becomes a problem. Because whatever those lamps were originally designed to do, they no longer fit the new model. They don't burn enough fuel. They don't require constant input. They don't justify centralized control. So, they are removed. Not archived, not preserved, not explained, just erased. And here's the most telling detail of all. The most ornate lamps disappear first. The ones with the deepest bases, the most complex crowns, the strongest integration with surrounding architecture. If these were just decorative, why not keep them? If they were merely gas fixtures, why not retrofit all of them? Instead, they are melted down, buried, smashed, discarded. And their absence leaves behind something strange. Cities that once felt unified, architecturally consistent, suddenly feel fragmented. Old buildings no longer match the street furniture. Historic districts lose their visual harmony. The streets stop speaking the same language as the structures around them. It's subtle, but once you notice it, you can't unsee it. And then comes the silence. No official inquiry, no engineering post-mortems, no serious historical analysis. The lamps are reclassified as quaint Victorian objects. The grids become primitive gas lines. The crowns become ornament. And the question of how these systems ever worked, or why they were built so robustly, is quietly set aside. By the time electricity becomes dominant, the old world is already gone. Not destroyed in a single event, but dismantled piece by piece, feature by feature, until only the buildings remain, stripped of the systems that once animated them. And that may be the most unsettling realization of all. Because what disappears here isn't just technology, it's memory. When a system vanishes without explanation, future generations stop asking how it worked. They only ask what replaced it. And whatever came before becomes invisible. So when we look back today and ask why 19th century cities appear so advanced, so cohesive, so engineered beyond their official timeline, we're not seeing evidence of fantasy. We're seeing the remains of a world that functioned differently. A world where energy, light, and infrastructure were embedded into architecture itself. A world that didn't need constant fuel, noise, or smoke to operate. A world that quietly slipped out of view when a new model took over. The lamps were not the system, they were the interface. And once the interface was removed, the system itself faded into history. Not because it never existed, but because it no longer fit the future.